name's Julia Willemyns, and I run a think tank in the UK called the Centre for British Progress. I'm here to speak about what European progress could look like. And to start off, I actually picked this one painting. It's one of my favorite paintings. It's in the Imperial War Museum in London, and it shows, after World War I, the long road to recovery. You have the typical trench warfare, but actually you see that the soldiers are moving away from the war field. And I think this is incredibly evocative because it sort of shows that the real challenge wasn't the war, but it was what came after. And obviously, after World War I, that was more disaster. In some senses, 100 years after that, I think we're in a similar turning point where you could get, like after World War II, a great boom of modernization and economic growth, or you could turn away and regress in some senses. So let's start. What is progress? Progress is a rallying force that a lot of people around, especially the Anglosphere, as I call it, so in the US and in the UK, have started to use as a way to talk about liberalism and abundance and material wealth as a way to improve living standards. But to me, I think progress isn't just about the economics of the policies, although that's primarily what we work on. So we see progress as economic growth and material wealth as a mechanism to achieve human progress. So how do I achieve human progress? So I think that, like, ultimately, I kind of did this the wrong way. Ultimately, the two things as a movement we care about is improving human welfare, and that's about current generations, but also future generations, and then also pushing the frontier of creation, and that's why we're really focused on technological and industrial frontiers. We care about two in a way because from a utilitarian perspective, we think that that helps with human welfare, but I actually think that there's something that utilitarian calculus that comes kind of out of this like effective altruism world that some people in the progress community come from, misses something incredibly important, and in something that's incredibly, I guess, European, or I would say also British, which is this aesthetic sense. Ultimately, I think that pushing the frontier of creation, whether it's in art or in social movements, is what makes us human and part of that progress story, which is why I like to think about that as well as the living standards and human welfare perspective when I talk about why progress and material abundance is really important. If we break free of these political and economical zero-sum games, then at the end of the day, we're not just improving people's lives, but we're also improving our own potential to push forward what it means to be human. So I kind of wanted to talk about like what that used to look like. I normally start these conversations talking about England, I guess, because that's where I'm from, in the Victorian era. So I like to say that we are all living in the shadow of the Victorians. We live off of their investments. We live in their homes. We benefit from their institutions. We ride their railways. And ultimately, the Enlightenment and the liberalism and humanism of that era actually powers the living standards that we have today as a society. But that's also the case where we are here today. So if we think about Brussels and more extensively Belgium, this Bruges was the place where we had our first stock market exchange. Antwerp was the trading hub of the world. We're 30 minutes from the cradle of capitalism, and one statistic that I found out today, which I found was really interesting, was in the 18th century, Belgium was faster at industrialization, at building massive coal and steel and industrial empires than the US. So in some senses, Europe built the modern world, but this country, which I actually hold a passport of, also built the modern world. And I think that it's really easy to forget about this and feel really down on ourselves because of our current situation. So what does human progress actually look like when it comes to how it impacts people's lives? One thing I always tell politicians when I talk about economic growth is you actually shouldn't be selling economic growth. It's not very sexy as a concept. Voters don't love it. If you go canvassing and you talk to voters and you say, oh, we're going to do this thing where, you know, GDP, we want it to go up, no one's going to vote for that. So how do you communicate human progress in a way that an ordinary person can really understand it? I talk about highest living standards in the world. And when I talk about those things, I actually describe them. What does that look like? It looks like cheap energy bills, cheap food. You're able to have cheap holidays. You got better treatments for diseases. And I also talk a lot about the technological and scientific advances that can actually improve human life. So, you know, we can take Europe created the epidemiological data that meant that 100 years afterwards we were able to fight COVID-19. CRISPR technology would open up incredible opportunities when it comes to disease treatment. I also talk about how building a dynamic and resilient economy that raises ambition and creates opportunity for all. Social mobility is higher in high growth countries. It is much higher in Poland. It is also much higher in the US than it is in stagnating economies like the UK, like Germany, like France. That's what like aggregate statistics show. Growth actually helps social mobility, and it also helps create opportunity for people. And then ultimately, I also talk about sovereignty and security, because I think that's incredibly important in today's day and age. You need to be a rich country to fight a war, and you need to fight a war to be protected from opponents. So I think when I was invited here, one of the things that we talked about was this abundance movement. I don't know if you guys have heard of Abundance, the book by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, but this idea kind of came out of a febrile Democratic Party trying to figure itself out after Trump's second election, and trying to build a positive future for what center-left liberal democracy could look like. Whether or not the Democratic Party is going to do this, I think is actually very tenuous. I was in DC recently, and I don't feel like we're going to get an abundance-coded Democratic candidate anytime soon. I would love to be wrong, but I'm not 100% sure that will happen. That being said, I do think it was a crystallizing moment for a lot of the conversations that me and my quite frankly, friends have been having for years, both in the US and also in the UK. This idea that actually we want to have more ambition, we want to be building for our current generations, for our future generations as well. There's this book that it's like, honestly like a kind of like a crappy fiction book from the 60s that I was reading the other day. And there's this one line where an old man is speaking to the younger protagonist and says, the Victorians, they didn't just have ambition, they had confidence in ambition. And I quite like that phrase. How can we build confidence and ambition? In the UK, what you see this also. There's this huge movement to make Britain rich again. That's Matt Clifford. He's a good friend and also was the Prime Minister's AI policy advisor. He was speaking at this grassroots movement, LFG, which actually is called Looking for Growth. Some people who are more online might realize that it has a secondary meaning, but I'm not going to say that on camera. Across the political aisle, you see movements for growth. Labour Growth Group is this coalition of MPs that has been created in Parliament. The Conservatives have something similar. And there are large essays about why Britain have stagnated that have been shared by both sides of the political aisle, or all sides of the political aisle. And yes, well, possibly the Greens didn't share this, but the idea there was really that there are supply-side constraints to growth in the UK. So there's this consensus that's starting to build, at least in the UK. What I built with David, who's my co-founder, came out of this. So our aim is to create. We launched in April, and our aim is to create implementation-ready policies for policymakers on economic growth and scientific and technological progress. I think the think tank ecosystem in the UK, and from what I understand in Europe as well, is very focused on having great grand ideas. I love great grand ideas. I love political theory. I love economic theory. That's what I studied. It is also a big passion for me. But David and I and me especially because I spent some time in the US looking at how the political system there worked, we thought that actually there was not enough practical work being done to make policymakers' lives easy. So what we try to do is create policy ideas that a minister could literally pick up and give to their civil servants and say, we've actually costed everything. We know exactly which department's going to do what, and this is how you fix the political coalition problem, and this is how you make sure your voters will actually vote for this idea. So policies that are focused on actually being implemented. Ultimately, we think growth is the most important thing. It's kind of the prerequisite for everything else that we want to get done. And that's also because of the political problem that I mentioned earlier. If you have a constrained government like we have in the UK, where guilds are skyrocketing because you don't have political stability, where you're stagnating in terms of growth, policymaking just looks like a zero-sum game. So if you give someone a subsidies, you're taxing someone else, or if you're taking money away from one group to give to someone else, that basically you just end up in like really adversarial politics. And I think across Europe we've been seeing this. So we think the best way to get out of this strange adversarial world is to grow your way out of it. It is possibly the least politically difficult thing to do because you're not just taking half of your population and saying, actually, we don't care about you as much anymore. We also think that it's actually the most important thing when it comes to what voters want. So I've done pretty deep analysis on the UK situation. I haven't really done it in Europe, but I see similar patterns having looked at it on the train ride over. I think that the lack of growth is one of the main reasons for populism. And one of the premises I use to argue for this, at least in the UK, and I think you can see in Europe as well, is that those most impacted by low rates of growth are the ones that are turning to anti-establishment parties. So this is in France. If you look at the 25 to 34 group, you have more than 50% voting for anti-establishment parties on the right, but also on the left. It's pretty similar when you look in Germany as well, but you see maybe both AfD and the Left Party do pretty well with young people. And then it's also down to wealth and whether or not you have assets to rely on with stagnating rates of growth. And yeah, this is the UK example, which is quite similar for young age groups. And this makes sense. I mean, if you look at most economic theorists like Thomas Piketty or lots of others, there's both on the left and right some consensus that in periods of low rates of growth, inequality tends to grow, and that's because asset-rich individuals have something to fall back on or to grow, whereas people who don't necessarily have assets, so young people or poor populations, actually suffer the most. And that's also the groups that you see feeling disaffected and voting for these sort of more anti-establishment types. So I guess I'm going to be relatively contentious now, if I haven't been so far. And I think we should feel pretty confident that our aim should be to make Europe rich again. I know that this feels really gauche to Europeans. It also feels gauche to British people. It's not very cool and intellectual to actually care about material wealth. It feels very American. But I do believe that that's the only way that you're going to also get the space to do the cool human progress stuff that I talked about at the start. So I think in any movement, the first step is to kind of have a view of the world you want to build. And I hope that in some ways this world of abundance, where we're not fighting over resources, but we're able to create new resources, and that people have opportunities to build new infrastructure, and confidence and ambition is something that we can all get behind. I think the sort of second step is to identify the problems. And then there's a third and fourth step of what are the solutions and how do you build the political coalitions to actually getting them done. I'm going to focus on the first and second mostly here. But before I do, I want to say, I think a lot of people, maybe it's like a Twitter thing, maybe it's an Anglosphere thing. There's this meme that Europe is really, really weak. And in some senses, it's been stagnating. But I think we kind of forget that Europe is fundamentally actually one of the strongest actors on the world stage. When it comes to our GDP, we're third behind the US and China. That's 1/7 of the global economy. We're the only ones that could really rival the Chinese or American bloc. And when it comes to protecting liberal democracy in the West, I think that it is one of the most important things to make sure that the EU is rich and strong and able to defend these values if you care about them geopolitically. The other thing that I feel like is a pretty big win for Europe is how much people want to be in Europe, and how positive being part of the Union has been for new entrants. So this is a really good IMF working paper. It basically shows that joining the EU makes you richer by a large proportion, 30%. That's pretty wild numbers, and also that it helps existing members when other countries join. So people want to keep joining. It's pushed forward growth, especially in Eastern Europe, an incredible amount, and led to increasing living standards there. Also, I feel like on the whole, there are all these memes online about how Europe is stagnating in ways that I think are not intellectually honest. I like to remind us that, in some senses, we're doing pretty well. When I'm online, literally, the other day I had someone message me saying, asking me if I felt safe in London. This American who lives in New York, asking me if I felt safe in London because of all the phone snatchings that were happening and the stabbings that were happening. Ultimately, there are some ways in which we're doing quite well, so we shouldn't feel dejected. That being said, I do think things are really bad right now. And if they feel bad, if they feel politically febrile, if it feels like people aren't happy on the streets, that's a pretty good indication that things actually are bad. So I don't want to, my first sort of set of points is, it's worth it, we should focus on it. This is what I tell Europeans when they tell me they want to move to the US. I'm like, okay, fair enough, maybe that's like helpful for your individual situation. But ultimately, like, making Europe big and strong is worth it because it's not a lost cause. That being said, you actually have to work on it. So in 2008, we were pretty much the same size of the US when it came to our economy. By 2023, the US's economy doubled ours. So we've like fallen behind really quickly, actually. If you look at young respondents, a grand majority of them think their lives are going to be worse off than their parents. And I mean, I feel this personally. My parents had incredible amounts of social mobility. I do not think my grandchildren will have the same opportunities as I did. What's really interesting, though, is if you look at, okay, let's break it down by countries. Which countries feel the most optimistic? Poland is one country that feels incredibly optimistic. And if you then look at GDP growth and map it onto that sentiment, you see Poland's growth is actually faster than the US. Germany, that was feeling quite depressed, is doing pretty bad. The other reason why I think things are pretty important to get right in this particular moment in time is because of the geopolitical instability that we're seeing in the region and worldwide. So this is both because we have increased threats across the border, but also because the US has taken away a lot of the support that has historically given us a lot of our security. And ultimately, we're not actually producing enough to protect ourselves against Russia in particular, but also other adversaries. So this is like pretty interesting. There's another graph that I was looking at, which was Russian GDP compared to European GDP. European GDP is still 5x Russian GDP. Maybe that makes you feel a little bit better, but you have to be able to build the ammunition, not just pay for it, to protect yourself. And industrial capacity is incredibly predictive of historical outcomes in war. You can look at World War II, and there's like interesting studies showing, German industrial capacity, and then when the Americans come in, their industrial capacity is pretty large, and that helps tip the war. Obviously a generalization, but it's pretty predictive. Great. So I'm going to go through sort of the policy areas that I personally think are important and talk about why I think in these policy areas, Europe's done particularly badly. This will plausibly be quite controversial. Okay, number one, tech is the main reason that the US has pulled ahead so far compared to Europe. If you look at growth in the last 20 years and you separate the top 7 growing companies, which are all US technology companies, from the S&P 500, you see this massive divergence in growth. The US's dominance comes from its ability to innovate at the frontier and produce large companies that are then able to drive growth. We don't do this. So if you look at superstar firms in America and you compare it to Europe, not only do we not have large firms, like so our biggest firm in Europe, which is Novo Nordisk, is half of the size. Honestly, now these numbers are even probably worse because of NVIDIA's massive growth. But when I last looked at the numbers, it was about half of the size of the largest company in the US. And then in the UK, it's another half. We also don't have many tech companies. You'll see that ours are like quite small. And also, if you then look at the company level data and you look at growth rates in these tech companies in Europe and you compare them to the United States, we're lagging behind quite a bit. So even when the tech companies do stay in the UK, it's actually new data that came out of Stripe looking at the growth of revenue in software startups in the US and in the EU and comparing them. So even when companies do stay in Europe, there is, for some reason, I wonder why, they lag behind the US when it comes to revenue. This isn't just because of AI. You could say, okay, the US is having this huge boom in AI. It's true. If it weren't for AI investments and infrastructure build out, growth in the US this year would be 0.1%. But even if you then take out the AI startups, you still see this massive difference in revenue growth. So something is slowing down startups from gaining revenue in Europe. What it isn't is talent. So I always hear my sort of compatriots in SF or friends in SF say, it's a cultural problem. Europe just culturally doesn't like innovation. You have bad engineers, maybe, plausibly. I just feel like that's incorrect, both because ultimately it was European immigrants that built the technological frontier in the US, and because even today, an immense proportion of founders in the US actually come from Europe. And that's just the founders. If you then look at the top engineers within top firms, that's even larger. So if we look specifically at AI talent, you see the UK, biggest exporter of AI talent to the US. That's not a good thing. That's probably a bad thing. Switzerland, Italy, Germany, France, all these European countries are producing fantastic human capital, but they're all then leaving to go build in the US. I could take questions, yeah. So I think those things are actually very interlinked. I think it's partially to do with actual regulation. It's much easier to build tech companies in the US than in Europe. Small things like GDPR, cookie banners, these affect startup companies. I have lots of friends who are startup founders, and they say that the cost, both in terms of the compliance cost, both in terms of bureaucratic time, but also actual money they spend on these things, means that they are at a disadvantage compared to competitors in the US. And obviously there's a pay thing, but to some extent that comes from us not having superstar firms that have the capital to be able to pay large salaries. So I think there's a bit of a myth that the problem, I think in Brussels there's this myth that the problem is competition. Maybe it is. I agree, the problem is competition in these industries, but it's not by capping productive firms that you're going to get that competition. It's by making it easier for entrants to enter the market that you're going to get that competition. So while you get M&A blockers in Europe that mean that you don't have these superstar firms that then have loads of capital to invest in R&D teams. So Google, for example, they have homegrown innovation through Waymo, which is this autonomous driving vehicle company. That would, I think, not happen. It would be much harder for that to happen in Europe because of anti-competitive pressures from the top. But then in Europe, you see blockers from the bottom, so it's much harder for new entrants to come in. When people say that there's when I meet Europeans to say that there's a competition problem with US tech firms, I say, well, OpenAI was a nobody firm. It was a philanthropy 5-6 years ago, and now they're one of the biggest companies in the country, and that happened. Within 5 years, they're now rivaling the Microsofts, the Googles of the world. I don't think that looks like a non-competitive market. Okay, why are the lights off? I think that we have an insane energy policy in Europe, and that's reflected in us having some of the highest industrial retail electricity prices in the world, in the developed world. I think we all remember when Spain had its blackouts recently. There was, I think, a real uncomfortable moment where where the engineers said, this happened / was made much worse because of the intermittency in our grid, because we didn't have baseload power to back things up. And then politicians are like, oh, you can't really say that because that's anti the rhetoric when it comes to how we're doing this transition, this energy transition in the continent. I think you should listen to the engineers when it comes to engineering problems and be realistic about what is and isn't possible. And increasing the price of electricity is influencing both consumers and businesses. And that is contributing to deindustrialization. That's not just a sort of talking point from populists. I also think it's incredibly connected to stagnation and the lack of economic growth happening across Europe. So this is statistics for the UK. I'm 100% sure, well, no, I can't say that. That would be intellectually dishonest. I'm pretty sure that if you try to do this for Germany, for example, you would see that the productivity of the industrial sector's outputs, and the moment when that starts leveling off, that's very connected to the total energy supplied and also the price of industrial energy. We don't see this so much day to day because we the Europeans subsidize industrial energy incredibly, but that's not free money. That's coming from somewhere, and it's also in some senses, I think, hiding the problem. The other thing that people will say is, this is a Ukraine war thing. That's the real driving cause. That's true. You do see big spikes after Russia invades Ukraine because of the price of natural gas and the sanctions. I'm pro-sanctions, by the way. But actually, these trends exist pre the invasion. So it's a thing that was already happening that got worse because of our policies. So this is very clearly also then impacting our manufacturing challenges. So if you look at all the energy-intensive industrial areas across the European market, but also in the UK, you see that the change in industrial production and then the price that they're having to pay is pretty correlated. there is, I don't want to sound, I feel like when I say these things, I sometimes feel like, I sometimes feel like I'm kind of the bearer of bad news, or someone will call me like a climate skeptic. I'm not a climate skeptic. I think it's incredibly important to figure out clean policies that will fix our situation. But you can't lie about the engineering or the economics to do that, because that's just going to create a political explosion down the line when people realize that you've been lying to them and their bills are going to go up and they're becoming poor. So, and there are solutions that are base load, firm power. I can talk more about the specifics of energy policy, but basically that can stay on all the time and are more reliable, and are also clean. Nuclear power is the main thing. But we haven't been able to build nuclear power that's both a policy choice. So in many places, there's decommissioning happening, which to me is crazy, because it is the surest source of clean power that we have. And then there are also building regulations that make it much slower for us to build out nuclear power in Europe. So France actually was able to build 56 reactors from the 70s to the 90s. In the last 20 years, we built 3, I think, and one of them took something like 35 years to build. Also, you can have both policy that is pro-innovation when it comes to technologies that reduce carbon in the environment, and also focus on your industrial energy supply and increasing it over time. China is a really good example. I think everyone will know that China manufactures the majority of key exports when it comes to decarbonization, from solar energies to batteries to wind turbines. They probably have net contributed to more decarbonization worldwide than any other country. That's a contentious claim, but I will make it. At the same time, they haven't taken huge hits on their energy mixes internally. That being said, they have then been investing very heavily when it comes to firm power energy sources and renewable energy sources locally that will, in the future, allow them to decarbonize. So they are building nuclear power plants, and they're building them quickly. Some of the fastest power plants being built are happening in China, and some of the biggest investments are happening in China. Great. Well, that's very connected to my next point, which is why can't you build anything? So the average project implementation pipeline in Europe is 10 years and more. Even if if we care about building electricity grids, solar PV, wind, EV stations, even when it comes to building these pro-climate infrastructures, we're incredibly behind other countries when it comes to the speed of building. This is not just labor costs. Everyone says, oh, it's because we have more expensive labor. Actually, if you break down the fixed costs, they are pretty static, and labor increases, but not that much. The main cost is compliance, bureaucracy, having to have new designs for particular areas for environmental regulation purposes. In the UK, actually, there was this one instance where building a tunnel, the planning application to build a tunnel was 3 War and Peaces. That was just the first application. And you can think about all the lawyers and regulators that had to be employed to make that happen. And that all contributes to this project implementation timeline, and also then the costs as well, which I haven't graphed, but are also much, much higher. This also impacts housing, which is some of the most important areas to get right. At least in the UK, it's the thing that we focus on the most. We have some of the highest housing costs in the world. And you do see this also in Europe. Our inability to build means young people, something like 25% of people from 15 to 29 in Europe are in overcrowded homes. I mean, I see this in London. My friends and I were all in these tiny little flats together, even though we have pretty good salaries relative to what our parents had historically. This has also innovation this creates innovation problems as well. So it's one of the theories in economics that I think is like most revolutionary, and people don't really think it's that big of a deal, but I was like blown away when I read about it, is agglomeration is pretty predictive of local innovation clusters and also of growth. So it's really important that we get our most productive people all in one place, because that increases innovation, and it also increases productivity. So when we're telling people, you know, we're not going to build in productive places like London or like Berlin, not only does that then influence the local like well-being of people who have then to pay really high rents, it keeps a lot of people that would be more productive in those areas out, and has quite big economic impacts for the country. Another incredibly difficult policy area to talk about in Europe is our labor laws. Labor elasticity in Europe is incredibly low. This has innovation impacts. So let's say you're a startup, you're trying to create a new product, and for whatever reason, your first go at it doesn't work. You had all these fluid engineers, and then you're actually going to do something completely different. You want to fire all the fluid engineers so that you can hire electrical engineers. In the US and in the UK, up until recently, there have been some changes in our labor laws. That would be relatively easy. You would be able to, you know, fire them and then hire a new set of people. And in some senses, those people that were fired because they had high confidence, they'd be able to easily find another job. There wouldn't be as much friction in the labor market and as much problems. And you'd be able to shift your operations to this new product. This is so much harder in Europe. And you see this actually impacting the ability of large firms in Europe to shift, to innovate into new product lines. So Volkswagen is a really good example. Oh, I'm so over time. Yeah, Volkswagen is a pretty good example. They really struggled, even when they've got China on their backs trying to take their business, they've been struggling to move to EVs. This is pretty bad for informal employment reasons, which is bad for immigrant integration, and also really bad for youth unemployment, because businesses don't take big risks on new workers. Yeah, there's also this whole like big thing I could talk about for ages on the single market, and how we think we have a single market, but we don't actually really have a single market in the same way, because we have internal trade tariff equivalents, mostly coming from like differences in service regulations. Like these costs, this is an IMF paper, these costs are crazy. When Trump put 100% tariffs with China, everyone was like, the world's going to end. When it comes to accommodation, we have 320 equivalent tariff rates. Anyway, something to sum up. So I think, you know, in terms of those four areas, when it comes to the UK, what's really special about the movement we've been part of and building is we have kind of the first thing done, which is figuring out, we have this vision for what could work, or what progress could do for the UK and how important growth is. We have some agreements on the problems. We definitely don't have agreement on the solutions, and the political coalitions are still being built. But ultimately, I think, you know, what's really important is having the dynamic culture and policy environment that's actually speaking to the true problems that the country is facing, and not trying to couch it in like comfortable untruths, to try to build a coalition that then is able to make progress happen in Europe. Yeah, and I think this is possibly the most important thing to do in the world right now, to make sure that Europeans can actually not. Oh, it's going so far back. Yeah, here, not fall back like way beyond what it used to be. Like, if we're thinking we've halved relative to the US previously, if we keep doing this, our influence on the world and our ability to influence liberal democracy over the world is going to go away. So I'd probably like that to be higher, especially with, like, you know, political environment in China and the US. Okay, thank you.